Hey, yeah, Danang, Dangaribino, Danganua, Mitchell Gibbs. So that's just saying hello, everyone. My name is Mitchell Gibbs, and I'm from the Dungari Nation. So today I'll give you, and wouldn't really say a perspective on innovative because these are practices and traditions that have happened for thousands of years. But I think in terms of Western science, they might be known as innovative. So I'll give you some background of some stuff that I did overseas with some First Nations communities, and then perspectives on Australia as well. So, so I was over in the Pacific Northwest. I did some work with some communities over there. So I was working with the Tlingit people up in Alaska. I was working with the Lummi Nation in Washington. I was working with a few people over in a few different communities in Hawaii as well. And they've been running long-standing traditions and restoration practices, obviously through universities, but originating in community. And so that whole community-led restoration has been extremely successful. The project I was leading was just going over and really learning from them, understanding what was so successful, what also was some of their challenges. So they, in the Pacific Northwest, they were building pretty much a rock wall to create a clam garden. Now, this will then obviously move into some Australian stuff in a sec, but the perspectives are quite similar. When you start having restoration practices based on Indigenous communities' knowledge, Indigenous community-led, you start getting a lot of impacts coming from that. So the first one being that bringing in these traditional practices of building these clam gardens. The clam gardens was Western idea from the universities, and the community always called them sea gardens. Now, the reason why it's garden is because it's constantly managed. You don't just set something up, hopefully it gets to a certain point, then it's restored and then you leave it. It's like traditionally even in Australia, when you're starting to restore something, your perspective isn't about getting it to a certain point in 10 years and then stopping, because the reason why it's managed to that point is because you've been working on it, not because you get it there and then stop. And then all of a sudden, weirdly enough, it doesn't come back to the state that you thought it would. And the thing with these sea gardens is that it's managing in quite a few different areas. You've got mitigating against climate change stresses. So it's bringing in more clams to be able to cycle through that CO2 in those areas, as well as having more algae into that space. You're allowing more biodiversity in that region as well. The way that it works is you build this rock wall in the beach at a certain point. How high it goes depends on at the level you want the beach to be at. And clams seem to be a little bit fussy. They're like Goldilocks. They don't really like it to be too high or too low in the water system. So once the rock wall's there, the level of the beach starts to kind of flatten out a fair bit, which increases the amount of range that those clams can be in. And that's a practice they've been doing for thousands of years. Outside of that, you've also got, should probably talk into the mic. You've probably got the eelgrass underneath. So the eelgrass is a very important food for salmon to move up the coast of America as well. And so that protects it, creating like a physical barrier. The other side of it is on the outside of that rock wall, you've got a rocky reef. And so you've got habitat complexity being increased, and you've got more biodiversity because of that habitat complexity. And so that's just, an example of a First Nations practice that is able to increase, be of increased benefit to the environment. The other side of that is that, yes, it's obviously a benefit to the environment, but you're also of benefit to the community. The community are being able to have a place where they can share their culture and practices. You're able to hear stories about different organisms that are in that place. One of the stories, and this is in a clam garden in Saturna Island in Canada, and we're there and we're turning it over. As I said before, it's a garden. You can see we're using garden tools. And so that uncle there's talking about how when you've got Indigenous people looking at food, we obviously used to understand when that food could and could not be eaten. Now things have changed, but the stories still remain. And so those stories, he was talking about a story where otters were the ones to show people you can eat clams, and showing that when those otters are eating clams, they just scoff them down. There's bucket loads of shells everywhere. But there's times when clams shouldn't be eaten because of the algal populations. So Alexandrium being a toxic algae. And so he's telling a story about the otters where they would rip the siphon off the clam and then eat the clam itself. Now, that then went to the universities, and the university was like, okay, well, why is that such an important thing? So they went through, they did the whole story sort of side of things, and then said, okay, in the clam itself, if you rip off the siphon, you're taking 60% of the cytotoxins that the algal has, but you're only taking 12% of the weight. And so you're increasing the efficiency of the food, I guess you could say, incredibly, just because of understanding what the organisms in the environment are doing. And so I know I haven't got too much time. Oh, shit. I'll brush through those. So I spoke for too long. So just very quickly, the benefits of using Indigenous cooperation for restoration is you're having cultural identity for these places. You're bringing back cultural practices to these places. There's trade, obviously, that happens between communities, and that also happens in Gamma at the moment. Like we do mullet fishing every year, and when the season's there, obviously, and when those mullet are there, we take them down to Eden and Wreck Bay, where other communities are, because they mightn't have that mullet at that same time, but they obviously would really like to. But they may have abalone, and we don't have abalone in Sydney, so we do a trade. Sovereignty is quite self-explanatory, and accountability, climate change mitigation, like I've spoken about. So on an Australian context, we're talking about bringing back traditional practices. So when we're looking at oyster reefs, traditionally Indigenous people would take off the oyster reef, but over a very long time they saw changes that are happening in the environment. So those practices changed, and so trying to bring those practices back in, where instead of it being on the oyster reef, you can put them on stakes, or when instead of being on stakes, they can go on leases. And so the transition of practices in an Indigenous context went from those oyster reefs all the way up into having actual oyster leases. I did have some photos, but they had some elders in there, and it's, don't really want to put those up. The other thing that I really wanted to come across was that it's the relationship that Indigenous people make with the environment as well. So relationships with the dolphins, to be able to herd in fish at a certain point in the water, and doing that by shaking shells on a bit of rope so that it sounds like bait fish. So then the dolphins come in, the bigger fish are scared of those dolphins, so they come in even closer, throw the net over and take them. But that relationship keeps happening because you're respecting the things around you. You're giving, once you take food, you're giving food to the dolphins as well. It's not just, oh, well, thanks a lot, we'll take what we can. It's a reciprocal relationship in between. I highly urge people to look up the Law of the Tongue. I'm guessing I don't have time. I'm done. All right. Look up the Law of the Tongue. That'll give you another understanding of the relationship. But knowing that Indigenous people create relationships with the environment and the things in that environment, and they're not putting themselves over or above anything else, they're making sure that everything is happening in the same equation. People, animals, the environment are all in that same equation. No one is above or beyond anything else. The last thing that, actually I won't even bother, don't worry. Marungu, thank you.